Lord Summers.
My lords, many of your lordships will remember that we had a former debate on this subject not long ago, introduced by the noble Lord Egremont. It was a good debate, and at the time was very well received, as far as I can remember, but unfortunately it didn't seem to have a great deal of effect. I think perhaps one of the reasons was that it did take on, during the debate, it took on rather a light-hearted atmosphere, and I think possibly that members of the House weren't really taking the subject very seriously. But I don't intend to follow that line tonight. Since then, of course, my lords, we have had the clocks fitted, but unfortunately it has proved only too easy not to look at the clocks. Now, perhaps I should say a word or two as to why I feel consideration of this subject is desirable. The first is one of pure practicability, and that is time. Your lordships all realize, no doubt, that our timetable is getting increasingly crowded. When I first came to the House, sitting Mondays were unknown. They've become quite a commonplace now, and we very often sit till quite a late hour. And when we have long debates, long lists of speakers, those who come at the end, if they have perhaps quite a long way to get home, are left with the unfortunate position of either having to remove their names or else stay in town. And I think perhaps I should declare an interest there, because that's the position in which I found myself only too often. And that makes things very difficult for them. But I think what I really want to emphasize most is that long speeches really defeat the ends for which they are made, because they cease to cease to hold the attention of hearers. One can tell that only too well, you know, by just looking round the House. As a long speech winds on its way, one can see noble lords leaning over and talking to each other, and others studying their order papers very closely, and others looking incredibly bored, or perhaps even going out of the chamber. And there's no doubt that a long speech, unless it happens to be a very brilliant one, is inevitably far less convincing than a short and clearly put one. Of course, I realize that the length of a speech is really very largely a matter of opinion. I remember once, not quite recently, there was a speech by a noble lord which I found absolutely fascinating from beginning to end. And I was really very surprised when I looked up and found that he had been close on half an hour. So it is largely a matter of opinion. But I do think that a short speech, clearly put, is far more likely to convince the House and to achieve its end than a long and rambling one. And also, my lords, when one has a long list of speakers, those who are near the end will almost inevitably find that everything that they wanted to say has already been said. Now, there is nothing whatsoever to be ashamed of in getting up and just saying that everything that you wish to say has been said, that you agree very much with some point made by some noble lord and would like to give your wholehearted agreement to it, and then just sitting down. It would save a great deal of the time of the House and would do you no harm whatsoever. Also, my lords, I think it's worthwhile just considering what the purpose of your lordship's House is. Is it a real House of Parliament which exists for the purpose of examining and improving legislation? And so protecting and improving the conditions of the country, or is it just a platform for those who are fortunate enough to belong to it to exercise their powers of oratory? If it is the first, and I don't think there are any of your lordships who deny that, then we can serve it best by making it work most efficiently. And by efficiently, I mean achieving the most in the shortest possible time. I think it should be possible to make your point clearly in about, and I say about because I don't wish to lay down any hard and fast rules, in about 10 minutes. There may be occasions on which you feel you must go on a little longer, but I think that 10 minutes as a rule, as a general rule, would be quite good. And I think it might not be a bad plan to have some remark as to that put into the companion to standing orders. It would be there for people who take the trouble to read that to remind themselves occasionally that is desirable. I make two exceptions, of course, to that rule. The introducer of the debate, I'm not going to take any advantage of that tonight, and the speaker who winds up for the government. Those, of course, will have to have longer because they will have far more points to cover. Now, my lords, there are just two other areas that I think are worth considering. One is starred questions. Now, my lords, the companion to standing orders says they are for the purpose of asking for information only, and not with a view to making a speech or to raising a debate. That's the end of the quotation. My lords, I have sometimes wished that more would keep that at the back of their minds when starred questions come on. It's only too easy, of course, to make it sound like a question by simply preceding it by the words, "Is the noble lord aware?" And that, of course, makes it comply with the regulations of being a question. But then, having said that, you can go on for about 10 minutes. And it isn't desirable. They should be, as the standing order, the companion to standing order says, they should be for the purpose of getting information, and that only. And the other area is the moving of amendments during committee stages. Those, again, tend to be used as occasions for making, as is so often called in your Lordship's House, a second reading speech. And it is unnecessary. All that needs to be done is for the mover to explain what the amendment is, what effect it will have, and why he considers it desirable, and sit down. But, my lords, of course, many people are not content to do that. But, as I say, this is not a platform for displaying powers of oratory. It is for the purpose of getting legislation through and getting it through as efficiently as possible. And therefore, I sincerely hope that your lordships will really consider this question thoroughly, and that perhaps something may be done. I have no intention of introducing any compulsory limit or anything like that. I wouldn't like to see anything such as I suffered from when I was on a delegation to a Commonwealth conference in Guernsey last year, where we were told that we must confine ourselves to 10 minutes. And when we got to 9 minutes, a bell rang, and we knew that we had jolly well got to bring our remarks to a close. That, of course, would be totally unsuitable for your Lordship's House. But if we could just have a little advice or persuasion, shall I say, from the companion to standing orders, I think it might be very useful. My lord, I beg to move.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My lords, I don't think that there are many of your lordships who would disagree with a single word that the noble Lord Somers has said. Equally, I don't think that there are many of your lordships who, after today's debate is ended, will pay the slightest attention to it. The noble lord has mentioned the resolution moved some 14 years ago by my noble friend the late Lord Egremont, that speeches in this House should be shorter, and this was immediately embodied in the companion to standing orders with the comment attached, "Long speeches engender tedium and tend to kill debate." Since then, speeches have become longer and longer, and bound volumes of Hansard have become thicker and thicker. More recently, my lords, the 1976 Brief Guide to the Procedure and Practice of the House of Lords laid down guidelines, very much on the lines suggested by the noble Lord Somers, as to what an acceptable length of speech might be, and your lordships will find them on page 9 of this invaluable guide. Lords opening or winding up debates from either side should try to keep within 20 minutes and should not exceed 25 minutes. Other lords should try to keep within 15 minutes and should not exceed 20 minutes. My lords, I have never heard a long speech in your lordship's house, good though many of them have been, that would not have been infinitely better had it been confined to 20 minutes, or even more so to 15. Noble lords just don't take the time and trouble to go through the mass of verbiage beforehand and winnow out what is worth saying from what is not. They leave it instead to their unfortunate audience to take the time and trouble to winnow out what is worth listening to from what is not. My lords, behaviour that I find quite intolerable in this House is for noble lords who have made long speeches early in the day and then leave the House before the end of the debate. Thereby, they are sparing themselves from the extra 30, 25, or even 20 minutes of sitting that they have inflicted on their better-mannered fellow peers. My lords, if the noble Lord Somers doesn't withdraw his motion for papers tonight, I have no doubt at all that it will be carried with acclamation. In parenthesis, it will be interesting to see with exactly what papers the table will furnish the noble lord. As I have said, I'm not optimistic about any long-term results. But even if only those noble lords who are speaking today comply just for a short time with what they themselves say tonight, something at least will have been achieved. And it is in that pious hope that I congratulate the noble Lord Somers, on his initiative.
My lords, I rise to say that I speak officially for the party. The Liberal Party are against long speeches, as we are against sin and various other things. But we must make a party point here that I have looked back the timing of speeches, and Liberal speeches are in fact much shorter than the speeches from the other two parties and indeed from the crossbenches in this House. And the content, of course, is infinitely superior. Lord Somers is greatly to be congratulated on moving this motion because it's one with which everyone will concur, and it will, contrary to the lecture read by the head prefect a moment ago, it will do a great deal of good, and I'm perfectly certain that noble lords will follow the Liberal example and say a great deal in a very short time, full of worth. When I was wondering what to say about this evidently virtuous subject, I thought I would look at the great speeches of the past. So I went first to the Gettysburg Address, and I got my long-suffering wife. And I said, darling, if you wouldn't mind timing me. And I ran through the Gettysburg Address. And I was really extraordinarily good, very fine, I thought, much better than the original. And that took exactly 90 seconds. So that shook me a bit. So I turned next to King Henry V and the speech before Agincourt, that marvelous speech. And I really had fun there, you know, let him have no stomach for this fight, right on to the lovely piece about gentlemen in England now are bad, will think themselves accursed, they were not here, and so on. By this time my wife was wilting a bit, but we went through that, the most famous speech probably, and the most stirring one, in 3.5 minutes. And then, greatly emboldened, my Lord Bishop, I turned to the Sermon on the Mount as set out in St. Matthew, which I think is the most complete one, but you can correct me, no doubt. And I didn't subject, my wife by this time was tiring, but I got through a column and then multiplied it up, and that took exactly 19 minutes. So I bethought myself that these were examples that noble lords could well follow. And if we can lay down in 19 minutes the whole of the ethic, really, for the Christian religion, it should be possible for noble lords, even Lord Harmond Nichols and Lord Bruce of Donington, to express themselves in a slightly shorter time than they have been accustomed to. And with these offensive remarks, I now wish to back Lord Somers to the limit of my ability and to hope that in future members of this House will so shorten their speeches that they will be so full of pith and wit and wisdom that the galleries will be crowded and the queues for the House of Commons will melt away.
The Lord sits down. Would he not agree that there's an element of predestination in all this?
I haven't studied Calvin, but interruptions of that sort lengthen speeches.
My lords, brevity is the soul of wit. So said Polonius, albeit, does this mean that any noble lord who cuts his speech by half be deemed a half-wit? That would never meet a chord. Far wiser are the words of Horace, brevis esse laboro obscurus fio. When I struggle to be brief, I then become obscure, while up above that silent digit reveals relentlessly each unforgiving minute. As every quarter hour elapses, then why not make it chime, my lords, to stop the endless flow of words? And if convention doth decree to moderate prolixity, 'twere best your lordships kept their glance adjusted to the map of France and made their speeches, waiving all excuse, neither too long nor yet too loose. But better still, my lords, by far, to keep your speeches as they are.
My lords, whenever I think of this subject, I imagine myself at a dinner party downstairs some years ago where a leader of your lordship's house, it was the late Lord Salisbury, and I were talking about the procedures of the house. And he said there are very few things in this house that can't be solved in terms of good manners and consideration for other people. He said that's much more important than the rule book. He said if you break the rules, somebody will tell you you're out of order, and if you take it in good part and apologize, you can recover and will be forgiven. But if you make an overlong speech, there is no recovery, and it shall not be forgiven you, my lords. Well then, if that is a good principle to work on, and if it is known that one is asked, as a backbencher or a crossbencher, to confine oneself to 10 minutes, as a matter of good manners, why not at least try and do so, my lords? Now, of course, it is not in mortals to command success, and if one feels a kind of rapport with the House and one gets carried along on the wings of oratory, one may overshoot a bit. But there's a difference between overshooting by 5 minutes and taking 3 times the length of the target estimate, that is half an hour or so. And I do think we all have an obligation to try and remember other people, the long list of people who are going to speak after us, the people who've spoken before us and have got to sit it out and endure what one's going to say. And it does seem to me there's a case for trying to remember what one is doing while one's about making a speech in your lordship's house, by reciting all the things one isn't doing. One is not delivering viva voce an introductory chapter to a textbook on the subject for attentive students. That is the wrong target to be aiming at. Nor should one imagine that one is delivering a lecture as opposed to participating in a debate. To prepare a manuscript of a set speech and then proceed to deliver it remorselessly without regard to anything that's been said beforehand or likely to be said afterwards is, to my mind, a lack of consideration for other people. And talking of that, if one has the good fortune to be speaking early in the debate, one of course can make the points that one knows perfectly well all one's friends and fellow peers are going to want to make themselves later on. So why not, in the words of somebody who gave me my business training, say, always leave something for the other guy. And without wishing to describe your lordships as guys, I do think it's a good thing for people who speak early to remember that people are going to follow them and not try and pinch all the other chaps' points. I think there's an obligation on everyone, my lords, to know his personal rate of delivery when it comes to preparing a manuscript. And I know we all of us have our own personal methods of getting ready to address your lordships, and I'm not going to describe or recite mine as if it was a sort of model for everybody else, but many people, in order to clarify their own minds and order their thoughts, will in fact write their intended speeches out in longhand beforehand, though that may not be the speech they're going to deliver, but it can be for many people a bit of self-discipline. Well, it's a very simple matter, my lords, to pre-calculate from Hansard what one's personal rate of delivery is. Every speech in Hansard is timed as to its beginning, and one knows the time at which one's successor starts. And if one has spoken for 10 minutes, and it occupies so many columns of Hansard, at so many words per column, it's a very simple rule of three sum, when one has given a speech, to find out what rate of delivery one is going forward at. I know in my own case it's about 100 words per minute, so that if I want to speak for 10 minutes, I've got to confine myself to about 1,000 words, and as there's nearly always a bit of overshoot as a result of ad-libbing or responding to some remark that somebody else has made, or making a wisecrack, or whatever it may be, it's as well to leave something in hand. And if you've got about 900 words prepared, yet really it will only cover one or perhaps 2 points, and leave the rest of the points for other people to enlarge on. That seems to me, to my lords, the kind of approach to the thing which makes debates interesting and lively, in very much the same way that a committee stage of a bill is interesting and lively, if it's a bill you're personally interested in. Of course, committee stages on bills which are on subjects one knows nothing about are not particularly interesting. But if, like, I remember the Patents Bill last year, which was a subject about a dozen of us in your lordship's house knew something about. And it was an extremely lively committee stage, very interesting, and there was the true cut and thrust of debate the whole way through. And if we could get a little bit more of that into second reading debates and motions for papers and the kind of formal set-piece debate which makes for the interests of our house on Wednesdays, I believe that we should get more people attracted to making livelier speeches, and I believe that that would be a very good thing.
My lords, I'm very glad indeed to have this opportunity of supporting my noble friend, Lord Somers. I can't say I absolutely agreed with everything that he said, because there are one or two points that I really rather differ from him. You see, I think it's very easy to make a political speech. You can make a political speech in a very short moment. But on the other hand, if you're really discussing some very technical matter, and every now and again we have very technical bills to discuss in the House of Commons, it isn't so easy to be short. Well now, as I was saying, if I was going to make a political speech, I could make it in a minute, because I would just simply say, I don't like this government, and I don't like its policies. Sit down. It's a little mean of me to say that today when the Lord Privy Seal was so nice over my question. But we both come from the same part of the world, and he knows that for 38 years I've been fighting for my party, and so sometimes I hope, and I'm sure he will, he'd accept a joke from me. But on the other hand, when I think of the technical problems, for instance, of dealing with the mining situation, I'm very fond of the miners. They've always given me an awful time politically, but I like them, and I like putting forward some of the problems that they have to face. Well, if you're making a very complicated technical speech, it's not so easy to be short. And then another point that I'd rather like to raise, which is this. You see, very often, we in your Lordship's house know exactly what we're talking about. At least I hope we always do. But when Hansard comes to be read, sometimes it's very important for all the people all over the world who really do look at Hansard. They learn quite a lot from it. For instance, the other day when I intervened in the debate on China, and I spoke for, I think it was 4.5 minutes, and I've been to China, and I just thought, well, the problems of China, the people perhaps who knew me when I was out there, they wouldn't really have thought that a speech made in our Lordship's house of 4.5 minutes, though of course my noble friend who introduced the debate had a great deal to say too, and quite rightly, but it's very difficult when you think that when you're trying to, for instance, if I might return for one moment to the question of a bill on mining or a discussion on the mining position, it's very hard for the miners if they read Hansard and see you've only spoken for, 10 minutes, because really you could not deal with the mining situation in 10 minutes. And so I make a very clear distinction between making a political speech, which, as I say, always too easy for words, and making a speech on a technical matter. And I think it's very important, and I don't think that this has been mentioned today, that what goes into Hansard is read by a great number of people who will be interested in the points of view put forward. And if you make a speech so short and you take out a lot of technical details, it doesn't really help people all over the world who are interested in certain problems. And I refer again to China. I really thought, I knew I had to be short, and I can be short, but I can assure your Lordships, I can speak for 2 hours without turning a hair. I'm not going to do it today, so nobody need be worried about it. But I never make notes. I never write a speech. I dare say my speech would be very much better if I did, because sometimes I think my grammar is appalling. But I find it very easy to speak. And as I say, I could just get up now and go on for 2 hours and rather enjoy it. But I do think that when we look at what is being said in Parliament, I think it's fair that when people who've got technical knowledge over something, it's a pity if they don't take long enough to see that the details of the technical matters are not included in Hansard. I think we might get into the position, because of course it can be awfully boring. I mean, as I say, if I attacked the Lord Privy Seal, well, we're both Northerners, and I like him, even if I don't like his policy. I like a lot of people who make very boring speeches, even if I don't like what they're saying. And therefore I think it's tremendously important when we're making speeches to realize either we're making a political speech, which in your lordship's house you can make quite easily, or a technical matter. And I find, since I've been in your lordship's house, I think since 1974, I've listened to some absolutely magnificent speeches, because most of the people who speak have really got some knowledge to offer. And if you offer knowledge to the world, and I think that we have a very great reputation in the world, if you really offer knowledge to the world, you may be helping the world to get over some of the very difficult and frightening problems with which they've got to speak. Now, I'm certainly not going to speak much longer myself, because that would be very unwise. But I think it was very right of my noble friend to talk about shortening speeches. But please, I do hope that we shan't forget the fact that it's quite easy to be political, and it's not so easy to be technical. And some of the matters that have got to be dealt with now are so technical that it would be a pity if people didn't take a little longer and make a speech on the subjects about which they know so much. For instance, I listen sometimes to people talking about mines, and really they talk as if all mines were the same. Well, if you've been in a mining area, you would know that the difference between one mine and another is highly different and needs different kinds of treatment. And I know sometimes when people talk about Rhodesia, well, you have quite a different view if you've been out to Rhodesia. And I always think I've been extremely lucky that I really had an opportunity of sort of traveling all over the world, and I know that I must be short in speeches. But I would like Hansard to record from all our lordships who really have the knowledge of so many important matters. I would like the Hansards, which are being sent out all over the world, to be properly expressed by the speeches that are made, so that they can help. And I think very often we're so busy in making our own speeches that we don't realize the influence that this country can make in these very difficult world affairs that we're facing at the present time. So thank you, I say, to my noble friend. As I say, some people say, I don't suppose anybody take any notice of what we say, but still, sometimes they do, and I've been very delighted to have this opportunity in speaking in this very important debate.
My lords, it's always a great privilege to speak after the Baroness Lady Ward. She very nearly gave me an immense relief, because I thought that she was going to touch double figures, and she almost did. Everybody else in this debate has admirably kept to their own prescriptions, the shortest being 1 and the longest being 3. I feel that it would be very unwise to go beyond 5, and I hope I shan't. I only have one practical suggestion to make, and that is not one which will be thought to be acceptable. What would make speeches a great deal shorter if instead of spoken in political English, they were spoken in Latin. We've had today 2 statements both of which took considerable time, followed by questions and commands, with the result that this debate of Lord Somers, and if I may paraphrase Shakespeare, Lord Somers' speech has all too short a date, has come on at a very late time in the evening. Well, my lords, I know no more Latin than most of your lordships, but I do remember one of the very shortest statements in Latin, spoken from his own brief, was by Julius Caesar, Vini, Fidi, Vici, which I suppose in political English would be, I arrived on the scenes, I took a look round, and I was an overwhelming success. Well, that's an easy brief, but he wrote it himself. Supposing he had to say Vini, Vici, Victus, Sum, that would have meant not only 4 words, but instead of 6 syllables, it got up to 8. And before that, in an even more difficult position, a government, when they had suffered, let's face it, a reverse at the time of the Battle of Cannae, one of the great difficult battles in history, I think, the statement made by the unfortunate member of their lordship's House, or Senate, what you call it, when he came out onto the balcony, he had to use actually, I think, was it 8 syllables? Magna pugna victis sumus. 8 syllables and 4 words. In ordinary literal English, we have been defeated in a great battle. In political English, obviously, from anyone on either side of this House, or even possibly from the Liberal Party, there has been an important engagement in which we have not perhaps succeeded in all our objectives, but no, that was going on for a long time. That's why I think that if speeches were made in Latin, A, Latin is more suitable, B, far fewer people would speak in it, if only because, like myself, I don't know how to pronounce it. I mean, I know in any other debate I would be corrected for pronouncing it like that. The noble Lord Segal did actually quote an admirable thing, I think, from Horace, if I get him right, saying, brevis esse labora obscuras fier, which he translated, I think probably rightly, as when I'm trying to be clear, I only become obscure. I suppose one could translate it, if I have a labour brief, the briefer it is, the more obscure it becomes. That might not be a good translation, but I do sympathise with any front-bench statesman who has a brief. The last thing I would say before I get on to 5 minutes is that speaking from a brief is one thing. Of course, reading from a brief is one is entitled to do, as the noble Lord Mackie pointed out. A brief can be read well from, as the noble Lord Denham reads it beautifully, or less well from, and the longer the brief, perhaps the more bored the reader becomes. Backbenchers, of course, do not speak from briefs, and they are the worst offenders, and I'm one of them. And there one has to think not of the word brevis or brief, but of the word curt, which is, I believe, the same word as derivation as courteous. How to be curt and curtail your speech without being rude, but being courteous. And I think, as the noble Lord the Earl of Halsbury pointed out, there is no contradiction between being short and being polite. That is what we in this House are supposed to do. They both come from, I don't know what the Latin word is, but to curtail something, to confine it, condense it, not to go on long after that. One has said what one wants to do. And all I would say is that Lord Somers, in setting this standard for us, was doing what this House ought to do. It was setting a magnificently high standard. But to make a speech which gets a great many points in and to condense it and to make it audible and to make it acceptable to the listeners is not an easy thing. I don't know that even the noble Lord, I like to mention him, as I think he's been mentioned before, Lord George Brown, who can make a speech of 38 minutes sound like 3 minutes or less. he differs in that way. He has this great gift. I do know, and I won't mention them, and I've been accused of it myself, of making a speech of 5 minutes and making it sound like 50. I see I've already spoken 5 minutes, so I'll now sit down thoroughly agreeing with everything that is said about the desirability of short speeches, but I don't think that they're easy to make.
My Lords, I've been a member of your Lordship's House for only a little over 2 years. And if this doesn't seem a sufficient qualification for taking part in this debate, I can only plead that in this time I've become something of an aficionado of speeches in your Lordship's House. And pursuing the analogy, there's no doubt that the matador who dispatches his opponent with one thrust is deservedly more popular than those who take a number of stabs before delivering the coup de grace. I also have read through the distinguished debate on the late Lord Egremont's motion in 1965. In that debate, the noble Lord Somers, to whom we are indebted for the revival of the subject this afternoon, made a speech of 31 words. It was too short for the time to be recorded, thus beating the record for brevity confidently claimed earlier in the same debate by the noble Lord Airedale with 56 words, also too short to be recorded, the timing. Incidentally, my Lords, just before the Leader of the House rose to reply on that afternoon, the noble Lord Gardiner pointed out from the woolsack that there had been 21 speeches in 86 minutes. I hope the reduced number of speakers today does not indicate complacency. In that debate, I think no one was in favour of a statutory limit on the length of speeches. It was the noble Lord Mancroft who reminded the House that on that occasion that the speech of the late Lord Keynes on the American loan, lasting nearly 1¼ hours, had not been a minute too long, while the late Earl Halifax had managed to swing the opinion of the Conservative Party on Indian reform in 9 minutes. So, my Lords, there are no magic numbers. In those perhaps more expansive days, a voluntary 20-minute limitation earned the approval of a number of speakers. The late Lord Casey quoted Lord Brabazon of Tara, who had said 10 years earlier, "I take the view that if you cannot say what you're going to say in 20 minutes, you ought to go away and write a book about it." On that occasion also, the noble Lord Tweedsmuir said, "You can get any subject into 20 minutes if you know what you're talking about." The noble Lord Carrington said on that occasion, "I do not know which alarms me more, the noble lord who rises with a large bundle of typescript, or the one who rises with no notes at all. The one takes a long time to end, and the other doesn't seem to know how to." As against that, the noble Earl Lord Baldwin of Bewdley said, "Speaking from scripts, except when obviously necessary, is discouraged," or was presumably then discouraged, I know. "But if they are good scripts, they can help to keep matters within bounds." Well, my Lords, how do we keep matters within bounds these days? I've done a little research. In the last 3 debates on motions for papers dealing with broad general issues, the average speech lengths were as follows. In the noble Viscount Lord Trenchard's debate on industrial recovery on January the 17th, 19 minutes. In the noble Baroness Lady Robson's debate on January the 24th on social and industrial policy, 17 minutes. And in the noble Lord Carrington's debate on the 25th on the industrial situation, 18 minutes. It may be significant that the debate with the highest number of lady speakers, which was Lady Robson's, had the lowest average of the 3. If we now turn to debates on specific reports, whether of committees of your Lordship's House or of other bodies, we find significantly shorter speeches. The debate introduced yesterday by the noble Lord Greenwood of Rossendale on the fascinating subject of relations between Westminster and the EEC Parliament yielded a 15.5-minute average. And going back a little, an EEC debate on November the 11th, 1977 on classification and labelling of dangerous substances averaged out at 12 minutes per speaker, while a motion on the report of the Post Office Review Committee, debated the following day, worked out at 16 minutes. On the whole, it seems that the average in this type of debate has recently been running out at about 14 or 15 minutes. It also has to be borne in mind that debates of that nature generally attract fewer speakers than those on broad general subjects. This would seem to suggest that the greater the number of speakers, the shorter the speeches should be. But in fact, the opposite is the case. My sample of the 3 recent major debates yielded an average of 18 minutes per speaker, which is surely far too high when there are frequently between 20 and 30 noble lords down to speak. Of course, there are various rules of thumb for controlling speech length. The noble Earl Lord Halsbury has told us that his personal delivery rate is about 100 words a minute. There's also the kitchen clock or stopwatch method of timing oneself in private. But if this method is adopted, it should be borne in mind that 50% should be added for live delivery to an audience. 8 minutes in the kitchen is 12 minutes in your lordship's house. I suppose we might have a warning bell, or a red light, or a buzzer operated by a button under the woolsack or at the clerk's table. But I suggest that the proper place for such a mechanism is inside each one of us. Well, not only do I see that I've now spoken for 5 minutes, but, my lords, I must sit down. There is something jangling in my head.
Lords, once upon a time, Gratian said that good things, if short, are twice as good. And Pliny agreed when he said that to be brief is almost a condition of being inspired. Horace said that every word that is superfluous flows away from a full mind, yet warned that brevity is many times the mother of obscurity. My lords, a speech should be short and like an epigram. What is an epigram? A dwarfish whole, its body brevity, and wit its soul.
My lords, I'm afraid, unlike many peers, I'm going to make what is a fairly serious speech, and it will certainly go just over 5 minutes. I've grave doubts about the wisdom of speaking in this debate, because my own stock in trade for some time has been short, terse speeches. If I'm frank, I'll admit that in part that is because I hope to get the attention of the House for a backbencher who is aware of the giants who stand on all sides. In the main, however, the reason is that this approach comes most easily to me, and I'm not good at constructing long flowing prose. I'm treading on rather thin ice, but I believe it's necessary to get to the root of the matter and consider some of the reasons why long speeches are made. Many peers continue to make them, sometimes with comparatively little real content. I suggest that, as with almost everything else, motives, constraints, and incentives are mixed. It would be quite wrong to accuse anybody of speaking solely for their record with posterity, where a full analysis of the problem is obviously appropriate, or for the quality of the prose style, or to cover the complete case, an organization in which they are interested, for an organization in which they're interested, or simply in the common phrase that they enjoy holding the floor and hearing their own voice. All these motives would of course be considered undesirable, but I suggest to some degree they affect any assembly, and I mention them so that each of us can search our own conscience. I suggest, however, that most of the difficulty is due to much more mundane considerations. Relatively few people are capable of speaking or dictating as shortly and succinctly as when they write a speech or a letter in longhand. And in speaking, they get led away into elaboration or sidetracked. On the other hand, if a speech is written out in full, it's often very difficult to cut it down without losing the overall continuity and spoiling the effect. Moreover, the speech may well contain some choice passages which cannot be introduced after it's been cut down. As the noble Lord Halsbury has said, I've been surprised that so few peers I've spoken to, in fact, if they've written out their speech, do count the number of words and realize that it's somewhere in the region of 110 a minute. So it's not very difficult to decide how a fully written speech will take allowing for a certain time, one hopes, for departing from it. And of course, you can always look up your old speeches in Hansard and find exactly what your own rate is. What can we do about it, my lords, apart from exhortation? The real problem is there are always some peers, and this has already been said in the debate, who one can listen to, as we did to noble Lord Brown, Lord George Brown, for a long time, and think that it's really only a few minutes. But they're usually experts in the subject under discussion, as of course he was. And it's invidious, of course, to try and make distinctions solely on that basis. One suggestion is that peers, other than perhaps when introducing a motion, should be asked to keep their speeches to under 15 minutes, except on not more than 2 occasions during one session. Most peers who are real experts in any field are very busy men and only speak infrequently, so they would be unlikely to be affected by this proposal. Another possibility for shortening debates would be to encourage peers to withdraw their names if most of what they intended to say had already been said, been covered. At present, when doing so, officers of the desk give one a feeling that it's chickening out. To some extent, they may be right, as it avoids staying to the end of what has become a boring debate. But with shorter speeches, I think the temptation of leaving early should be much less. I disagree with Lord Somers, noble Lord Somers, on one point, and that is question time. I think one of the most interesting times in the House is question time. Of course, the questions can get out of hand, go on too long, and people can abuse the privilege. Nevertheless, I would be extremely sorry if any genuine attempt was made to shorten the time we take. I think they're valuable. I think the government very often makes no endeavour initially to come clean and rarely tell us the answer to the question. So they deserve, in a way, what they get. In any case, I think it's entertaining, and I would think that the people in the gallery enjoy this far more than hearing some of the very lengthy speeches which we get. 6 minutes, my lord.
My lords, I know the noble Lord Somers will not take it amiss if I say that I shall reply to his motion as briefly as possible. As leader of the House, I feel it incumbent upon me to set an example on this occasion, particularly as I found it necessary to make a very long speech last week, a speech of 30 minutes. I very seldom speak for as long as that. May I say the virtue of short speeches has been recognized by some, perhaps by most, of your lordships for some time. Go right back, though. Queen Elizabeth I held the same opinion as early as 1576, when she became impatient and interrupted the Lord Keeper, Bacon, and commanded him to cease when he was delivering a flowery speech of thanks for a subsidy bill on her behalf. Well, in more recent times, there have been several attempts to curb the verbosity of peers. In 1887, Lord Denham introduced the duration of speeches in Parliament Bill. He recognized that some speakers might be able to delight the House for 3 hours, but for most, 15 minutes was, in his view, adequate, and he implied that what was adequate was best judged by the House and not by the person speaking. Well, I'm sure this is true today. Well, I'm happy that no one speaks for 3 hours at a time now, but if the speech is a bad one, even 15 minutes can seem far too long. I have no doubt that your lordships are capable of brevity. In July 1965, 25 lords spoke on a motion by Lord Egremont in favour of shorter speeches by 5 o'clock in the afternoon. This demonstrates it is quite possible to have a crisp debate in which a large number of peers speak without the debate lasting for several hours. Our experience with short debates has shown the same result. Many short debates do not last for the full 2.5 hours. But on occasions when speakers are numerous, and it's clear that time will be divided between them, those speaking in the debate have always agreed to cooperate. Indeed, on very rare occasions, speakers agree to confine their speeches to between 5 and 10 minutes in other debates, although I must say that on these occasions the request is often unpopular. However, although we now have clocks in the chamber, and no one can claim that they don't know how long they have been speaking for the records, show that the presence of clocks has not made any difference to the length of speeches. They have merely succeeded in making noble lords listening more conscious of time, but somehow this consciousness vanishes when noble lords are on their feet. I think the noble Lord Kilmarnock mentioned about clocks, which reminded me of an incident in another place. I was there when a front bench spokesman was speaking, and he had a very fine wristlet watch which had an alarm, and it went off when he was speaking, and the whole house shouted, "Hear, hear." So clocks or watches would not be suitable. The sad but inescapable conclusion which anyone must reach who examines recent initiatives to persuade members of this House to be brief is that they have all come to nothing. My Lords, as leader of the House, I have no cure to offer, save vigilance of members of the House. I could not support the introduction of a time limit on speeches imposed by standing order. This is a self-regulating House, and its procedures have remained relatively simple and uncluttered because we have not multiplied standing orders unless they are unavoidable. In this case, it is up to individual members of the House to encourage brevity. If noble lords feel shy about interrupting a speech, they can always approach the noble lord after the debate and let him know of their view. My Lords, we must remember we do not have a speaker, and I do not think it should be incumbent upon the leader of the House to take on a speaker's functions. I find that I have to intervene all too often for my own liking to bring questions and questions on statements to a close. But I only do so if I feel that I am expressing the wish of the House. For these reasons, I would be opposed to any suggestion that the leader of the House should be expected to control speeches in any way. My own view is that 10 minutes is usually quite enough time in which to put forward a personal viewpoint. I regret that it is often not enough time to put forward a view which represents government or party policy. And of course, it is unlikely to be enough for a government spokesman who is expected by participants to answer points they have made during the debate. But here, my Lords, I would like to make a point from the government angle. Government spokesmen all too often feel that the House or the mover of a debate will regard it as discourteous if the government reply is brief. The spokesman often feels obliged by the acknowledged importance of the subject to prepare to speak for 10 or 15 minutes, in addition to the time required to answer points not covered by his prepared speech. My Lords, if the House wants shorter speeches, I hope that it will also accept shorter government replies. In conclusion, my Lords, I can only join with the noble Lord Somers and other participants in the debate in exhorting members of the House to be as brief as possible. Very few speeches benefit from great length, as noble lords have said earlier, but short, incisive speeches are often those which provoke most comment and interest. However, as I have said, I am not a believer in imposing time limits on speeches, and in the last analysis, I believe it must be up to individual speakers and the peers who to listen to them to do their best to ensure that more speakers speak briefly.
My Lord, I should like to thank all noble lords who've taken part in this debate, and particularly the noble lord, the leader of the House, who's had the onerous task of listening to two complete debates and answering them both. I should point out, I think, that I wasn't recommending any imposed length of speeches. It was merely a recommended one. And if somebody wants to enlarge on a technical subject, as my noble friend Lady Ward was suggesting, there's nothing on earth to prevent them doing so. They need the extra time and they should have it. But this, as I say, was merely a suggested length for those who can keep within it. I was sorely tempted, I must say, by the noble Lord Denham not to withdraw my motion, but I once read an account of what happened if you didn't. And that frightened me so much that, my lords, I beg leave to withdraw my motion.
Is it your pleasure that the motion be withdrawn? The motion is by leave withdrawn.
Second reading of the Criminal Evidence Bill, the Viscount Dilhorne.
My Lord, after this short debate on state aid to political parties, and this short debate advocating shorter speeches,